Welcome to the first episode of Mamba Moments on the Believe Podcast Network.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Mamba Moments. And we have here with us today the legendary Kamenetsky brothers, who have done an amazing job of covering Kobe and the Lakers over the years and providing international fans with a window into the insights. And these guys truly get Kobe. Brian and Andy, do you guys mind telling everyone a little bit about yourselves and your history with Kobe and the Lakers?
We began covering the Lakers full time in 2005, the 2005-2006 season. That was the season that Phil came back, otherwise known by a lot of people as the Smush Kwame years. And we had been around the team in a more limited capacity before that, doing some stringer work for ESPN, the magazine. And we also have lived in LA for a while, so obviously had been, in proximity of Kobe's career. But that's really when it began, was that 2005-2006 season, which, as it turned out, was exactly the second half of Kobe's career.
Amazing. Very, very good stuff. And Brian also does a lot of great work with Andy, writes some phenomenal articles. Oh man, gotta have that sibling rivalry, right? That athletic article that you wrote, Brian, recently was absolutely incredible for with Kobe. And you guys did an amazing podcast interview or show about Kobe with The Athletic, and you said that no one's presence was larger than Kobe Bryant. And I wanted to ask you guys to elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, I think when you look at what Kobe was in the city, a guy who was, played for the same team for 20 years, and he really he changed how we look at stars in this city. Like, players are supposed to have a certain way of doing things. You're supposed to approach things, if you're the star of a team, in a certain way, with as Kobe did. And, other guys get compared to him whether or not they play the same sport as Kobe does. And so I think when you look at his impact around the city, it goes beyond just, the Lakers and how we think of the franchise and what he brought in the 5 titles and all that. He really changed, I think, the kind of the mentality of how we view athletes. Mm-hmm. And that's really just because he was here for so long and was so distinctive in terms of how he approached things, and kind of the mythology that built up around him, which he had a large role in creating. Yes. And all that. So I think when you talk about his impact that way, that's really where it comes from.
Anything you'd like to add, Andy?
Like Brian said, there was that mythology that I think Kobe was very self-aware in terms of the way he went about branding. I mean, it was this combination of earned mythology and also very proactive mythology. I've always marveled for a long time how Kobe managed to brand the concept of unlikability. That period post Colorado where, a lot of sponsors had dropped him. He hadn't quite, I think, restored his brand, his legacy, his image, all of that stuff. And he really leaned into that idea of, I'm going to be the villain of the NBA. And it's something that we've seen other players attempt to do. And most of them have not been successful because most people, I don't mean athletes, I mean people want to be liked. It is human nature to want people to like you. And, Kobe had plenty of people in his corner, which made, putting on that black hat easier than it would be for a lot of other athletes, just because Kobe has, he has a fan base that is as loyal and rabid and zealous as anything I've ever seen in sports. But it was just interesting to see him do that. And then as time went on, I think it turned more into just genuine appreciation, around the league, among fan bases. I mean, it was funny when he did that farewell tour. Kobe even remarked about how he would have preferred a little more booing, as opposed to just the pure accolades that he got, which I'm sure he appreciated.
It was a little tongue in cheek, but not completely. It was
right. I mean,
fueled
he fed off that stuff in ways that a lot of athletes say that they do, but I don't think that they really do. He really did.
It was sort of a callback, I think, to earlier in his career where that sort of thing really, I mean, at that point, he wasn't the same player. The Lakers weren't good. So, I mean, it all kind of lined up well. It would have been very interesting to see what would have happened had Kobe been a little healthier, the Lakers been a little bit more competitive at that time, like how his tour would have been received around the league, how he would have treated it, in the context of a playoff caliber team or a championship caliber team versus what they were. I mean, it allowed the light to be shined on him in a way that I think was great for his career. Kind of nobody had to care about any of that stuff. And so it was that part of it, I think, worked out really well.
Absolutely. No. And personally, I watched all 82 games of that season, was lucky to go to the final game. I knew that, you wouldn't get to see Kobe Bryant on the court again, one of the greatest 20-year.
Did you even watch the ones that he wasn't playing in? Because
because they added to the storyline. They added to the storyline of Kobe coming.
I was paid. They paid me to watch those games, and I'm not sure I watched all 82.
Yeah, no,
that was a terrible basketball team.
It was all for the Black Mamba. Absolutely. No. And I'm lucky to have, followed his whole career, read every article and interview. And the guy is just inspirational beyond all proportion. And so, with that, one thing you guys mentioned was Kobe feeding off of the booze. Where do you think that came from with Kobe, from what you know, or how did he sort of use that to fuel him? Because that's something that a lot of people just can't do. You take the hate and you internalize it. And he found a way to really use it as fuel to actually perform and inspire others.
I think it's just athletes find things, many athletes really do look for the slights. They look for the people who think they can't, look for the people who think they can't, won't be able to do something. Michael Jordan was famous for inventing slights against him. Who was it in the documentary, Andy, that they went
George
through?
Karl, I believe.
No, it wasn't George Karl, but the player.
Oh God, I don't even know.
There was like
guy.
one guy that was like some guy who played for the I think the Wizards or the whatever it was, or the Bullet, might have even still been the Bullets, and he just destroyed him. Like this one, his only claim to fame. It'll come to me at some point in the conversation.
Yeah, he made up the story.
Yeah, he just invented something that this guy did to him, and just torched him. And Kevin Durant does it, and a lot of players do it. And I think this probably is something that Kobe may have taken from MJ. Is using the slight as motivation. Kobe himself never bought into his own kind of athleticism. He always thought, tried to portray himself, and I think really did look at it as, I will get where I'm going by hard work. He downplayed his own talent in that regard, I think is what I'm trying to say. And so Kobe was remarkably athletic. He was remarkably talented, genetically gifted, and all these other things, but he didn't want to lean on that. So he downplayed those gifts in kind of in service of getting himself to the gym at 4 a.m. every day and all those other things, because that's what he knew. He thought he needed to be the best player. And so it all kind of is part of that same ecosystem. And so he finds slights in his own talent. He finds slights in things that other people are saying about him. Other people are writing about him. People don't work as hard. And then, you look at Michael Jordan, whose game was obviously, very tightly patterned after. And that's what MJ did, is he found slights in what people were saying. And so if fans were going to boo him, that's something that he could turn around and use as motivation. And they don't boo you unless they care. They don't boo you if they don't respect you. And
look at the chance he got in places like Boston after.
Right. So, I mean, I think that's a lot of it is, he understands how that dynamic worked, and it appealed to him.
Wow. That's very cool. Andy?
Yeah, I was also going to say, I mean, there was though too. I mean, that he needed to lean into it initially because, I mean, Ramona Shelburne, I believe it was, wrote a really good piece for ESPN several years ago about how Kobe invented this Black Mamba persona out of the darkness that he was going through in the mid 2000s. Shaq getting traded, but initially fans were angry at Kobe over that. Like, Kobe got blamed for that three-peat group getting dissolved, and Phil Jackson leaving and Shaq getting traded. And obviously Kobe bears some responsibility in that happening because he was part of that dynamic, but he was not the sole reason that all of that did happen. But either way, though, I mean, it's easy to forget now, but Kobe was less popular than Shaq was among a lot of Laker fans at the time. Kobe was coming off that 2004 finals where he honestly played pretty badly, and he shot them out of that series against Detroit. He had that one game where he played really well and pushed into overtime, and I believe that was the one game that they won in that series.
Yeah.
But by and large, Kobe did not play well. So there had been a lot of bad will built up locally against Kobe. Like, I remember Brian and I were at the first game that Shaq returned as a member of the Heat. Shaq got a standing ovation when he got announced. Kobe actually got booed. And this was inside Staples Center. And eventually Kobe played really well in that game, and he won over the fans the same way he always did. But it's important, and I think fascinating to remember that really came from this place of necessity. And I think in Kobe's mind, self-preservation. Like, it was a very dark period in Kobe's career. And because he decided to do that, and also because Kobe is incredibly self-confident and frankly very creative in the way he went about doing a lot of this stuff, it managed to turn into this very interesting market. He managed to remake his image while leaning into, for a while, unlikability, which is unlike anything I've ever seen before. It's just Brian and I have always found that a very fascinating part of his career.
Wow, what great insight. No, absolutely. Thank you, guys. One other thing I wanted to get your insight on that you alluded to a little bit is Kobe's fans and Kobe's fans fighting for him, and particularly being journalists in Los Angeles. You guys must have a really unique view. Yeah, I want to hear any great stories about that. Why? I mean, it's just a fascinating aspect.
How much time do you got?
As much as you need.
Here's the thing. It's like the Venn diagram of Kobe fans overlaps the Venn diagram of Laker fans. There's no question about that.
Yeah,
but they're not the same thing.
We're not exclusively the same thing, if nothing else.
Right. That's what I'm getting at. So it's like, they are, you are, especially when you go back to those more controversial years. I mean, by the end, Kobe, for all the talk of Kobe being the most polarizing athlete in this, by the end, he really wasn't. Everybody kind of agreed on who he was, and everybody was happy with it. The Lakers weren't.
I think he would have preferred to have been more polarizing down the stretch.
I think so too. But like, right, when you really go back to that era where he was genuinely polarizing, like, there was very few basketball fans you could find who were like sort of opinionless about Kobe Bryant. Like, that just wasn't a thing. And the loyalty that fans had to him was often bigger than the loyalty they had to the franchise. And it was, I think it was the first part of a more modern dynamic of how NBA fans look at players in the league. But it was also unlike anything I'd ever seen, like, in terms of like people genuinely being willing to give up their allegiance to a franchise if they didn't think they treated Kobe in the right way, or if Kobe was wrong, or they would have followed Kobe to the Clippers or whatever it might have been. And so to say that, particularly in the early days when we were doing the stuff for the LA Times blog, and nobody quite knew what any of the online platforms were going to be, and the comment sections were pretty Wild West style and all that. People were bleeping nuts. Like, they were insane. Like, you couldn't say, like, I'm not saying everybody, because not everybody comments on a blog, people read and don't, but like the people who did comment, they were freaking nuts. Like, you can't say anything that was even kind of a slight or perceived as a slight without people going crazy. Like, Andy wrote a column about how Kobe should be the MVP of the league. What was this, 2000?
It was 2008.
2008.
Like the
And
one he
everybody
won?
got mad at him.
Yeah, it was the year
Nice.
that Kobe won. I wrote a piece for the LA Times for the blog that Brian and I ran for the Times about why Kobe should be MVP that year. And the overwhelming majority of comments from Kobe fans were just screaming at me about how this article just proved how much I hate Kobe. And just like all of the reasons that I was giving for Kobe were really backhanded compliments. And they really demonstrated just how much of a personal distaste that I have for Kobe. Again, I will remind you, this was in an article that I wrote about why he should win MVP that year. But I used to always say that like the Kobe fanatics used to view him as half basketball god, half political prisoner. And like, you know, they would walk out in the street and block a car from hitting Kobe, but be disappointed that it wasn't a bus. Like a bus would have been more impressive than a car. Like they would have been disappointed by the fact that it was just like a typical 4-door sedan. But I think you also though have to.
And he
The
might have jumped
Temecula
over it
thing
in the
was real.
commercial
Like people,
too.
people would go to like that was not a fake thing. Like people,
No,
there are plenty of people who would hop in a car and go
just
drive to
do-
Temecula to fight.
I
about
was just
Kobe
going to say
Bryant.
Google Kobe and Temecula.
Yeah.
And that's all you need. That's all
I
you need to
remember
hear.
that story with the guy who was literally going to go fight someone, but
Yes.
oh my goodness.
But what you do have to remember though, as far as that psychology is, there was a period where being a fan of Kobe, I imagine, did feel like a 24/7 job where you were always having to defend the guy.
Yep.
And you were, you know, and
I was
by
there.
extension, defend yourself for being a fan of Kobe. And after a while, you know, psychologically habits start building up. And you become, in some ways, you start looking for the same slights about Kobe as Brian was talking about before. Kobe used to look for those slights in terms of motivation on the court. Like I remember we had this regular commenter on the LA Times blog who was frankly a psychopath. I mean, this guy really, I hope the authorities have found him. And I hope that he is residing somewhere in a 6x10, because it really seems like that's where he needed to be.
Yeah.
But he used to talk about how he was living at Brian went in Cleveland. Isn't that where he was living?
I think so.
He was living in Cleveland, and he used to talk about how he would be in bars and he would look to bring up Kobe because he would look for people to say things about Kobe negative so he could get into a fight with them. And as he would always say, punch him in the throat. He was always looking to punch people in the throat, saying bad things about Kobe. And I even said to this guy in the comment section, I'm like, do you think Kobe wants this?
No.
Like Kobe would be like, what the hell's the matter with you?
No,
like,
no.
like, don't do this and don't do this in my name.
Yeah.
Like that is sociopathic, psychopathic criminal behavior.
Yeah, but
God.
to Andy's point, though, I think like what Kobe became was essentially sort of a Rorschach test for how you viewed basketball. Like, because it was so much, and this is just on the cusp of the analytics movement and where, the efficiency movement in basketball. And Kobe, efficiency was not his hallmark. But it was sort of the avatars for that were, Kobe as the individualist basketball player versus really sort of a Tim Duncan, like, the guy who is part of the glue of the team and makes his teammates better, or all this other. And like, Kobe got slotted into this idea of like, somebody who didn't make his teammates better, which is absurd. I mean, like the amount of players who looked awfully good next to Kobe and then went somewhere else and sucked. I mean, there's plenty of it, but so some of the arguments really were genuinely unfair. And I think were related to people just kind of not liking him and not liking his personality and that persona. But that whole era was fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And his fans often were insane, just like
Yes.
sometimes in a good way, but in a way that as a journalist and as a writer, you're just like, come on, people. But then you get it because of the emotional investment that Andy's talking about. Like it really was something that it was harder to be a Kobe fan than to be a Tim Duncan fan.
Oh,
Harder to be a-
100%.
harder to
And
be a
I
fan
mean,
of Kobe than
being
any harder way.
definitely, absolutely. No, thank you guys so much for sharing that insight. On my end, I guess being Canadian, I never had the urge to fight anyone over Kobe or anything like that. But no, I think, where I come from, as we'll say, more of a rational Kobe fan overall, you know, I love the greatness of other players as well. I think that it's that attachment to that mentality of overcoming the odds. And I think that some people are able to sort of see the growth of him as a father and everything throughout his life and be really attracted to that path of greatness and wanting to sort of embody that. And that Kendrick Lamar Nike video, you know, be a better version of yourself. That's how I've always viewed.
Oh, sure. I mean, but what I think was what's fascinating, what's interesting about that is like overcoming the odds and this and that. Like, it's not like.
Tune in next week for part 2 of my interview with the Kamenetsky brothers on Kobe Bryant.